we're going to be hearing from one of the contractors who've worked on the major conservation project, which is now underway. Let's meet now the two people who are going to be talking to us about their work this evening. And let's start with Andy Knight. Now, Andy was a foundryman for over 47 years, who started his career as an apprentice in a South Gloucestershire foundry, and who moved north because of education and work. Andy is a past president of the Yorkshire branch of the Institute of Cast Metal Engineers and has worked at Hargreaves Foundry for the last 13 as foundry and pattern shop business manager. Good evening, Andy.
Good evening, David.
And on to our second guest for this evening, Michael Hinchcliffe. Michael is the face of Hargreaves Foundry and his current job title is chairman, although he says he thinks this is a little preposterous, as what he really is an iron founder and proud of it. Michael has been an iron founder for 45 years, the last 37 at Hargreaves. So good evening, Michael.
Hi there, hello everyone.
And welcome to the Iron Men of Halifax. So before we talk about your work on the Elizabeth Tower Conservation Project, let's have a quick roundup of some of the other work you've done in recent years, starting in Halifax and then travelling around the country. Now, this is the Peace Hall, founded in 1779, which opened in 2017 after a major conservation project. Can you tell us about your contribution there?
Yeah, so you can't quite see it in detail, but there's cast iron guttering around the edge of this quite large building. It's a beautiful building with the sandstone columns you can see there, and it's a complete rectangle. And it was built just purely for trading cloth, which says a lot about the textile industry in this town. And then further into the front of the photograph are the Peace Hall planters. So they're cast iron planters that are planted up decoratively and can be moved around to change the appearance of the Peace Hall. So really proud to be working on such a prominent, beautiful building in Halifax, our hometown.
Lovely. And let's move now to Manchester and some attractive but functional cast iron bee planters, which you recently made for the City Council. Can you tell us a little bit about them?
Yeah, the Manchester Council approached us 5 or 6 years ago to make some planters. I think they got a dual function. One, obviously, to make the urban design of the city centre look spectacular. They got plants there. It gives a bit of greenery to the city centre. Also, there's a function for security as well. That's why they're always clumped in trees, just to ease people around and things like that. So they're great, and we were very proud to have made these for Manchester.
And I think it's true, isn't it, that the bee also features on other street furniture like bollards and waste bins and seats. So there are bees everywhere if you look for them in Manchester.
Yeah, I mean, hopefully within a few months we'll be working on Manchester Town Hall, and that's got the mosaics of the bees in actually the flooring of Manchester Town Hall. So it's been a symbol of Manchester for over 2 centuries now.
Wonderful. Right, so now a much larger project in London, and the 396 cast iron columns that you made for 1 Pancras Square, which was opened in 2013 and is situated close to King's Cross Station.
Yeah, it's great that the cast iron was used in a more contemporary style, showing how versatile it can be. And yeah, great project for us, and another reason for us to go down to London to King Cross Station. This building's in between King Cross and St Pancras, and it's great to be able to see our cast iron in a contemporary style and usually used in such another prominent place.
And I think it's true, isn't it, that kind of decoration on those columns is something that you can only do in that detail using cast iron.
I'm sure it could be done in other materials actually, but it certainly suits cast iron. It's great going down to have a look at this thing, and there's somebody roaming around tapping the material and wondering what it is. But it does fascinate people, and it's great to be on hand the few times I'm there to inform them that it is cast iron from Halifax.
Wonderful. Great, thank you very much. And just one other area we'd like to look at, and that's where you've collaborated with artists on fine art castings. And this artwork, I think people might recognise, but it looks like it's on the wrong scale in this photograph. Can you tell us what we're looking at?
Yeah, it is on the right scale, actually. It's Anthony Gormley's Angel of the North. We made a couple of these for him before the big angel went up in Gateshead in '98. And these are Anthony's life-size angels. So they're 6'4" tall, and you know, with the forerunners really to Gateshead's large steel angel.
Fantastic. I think that Anthony Gormley, actually Sir Anthony Gormley, I believe he is now, you've had quite a long ongoing relationship with him, and I'm sure some of our audience might be familiar with some of his other works, like the 100 Figures on the Beach at Crosby in Merseyside. I think that's called Another Place. And I remember very well when he put 31 figures on the roofs of buildings in London facing the river. It was called Event Horizon. It seems hard to believe that that was 2007. It seems so recent, but it's great that you've had that long lasting relationship over 25 years with such a well-known artist. Now, talking about relationships, I would like to talk a little bit about a relationship that you've had with Shepley Engineers Limited of Sheffield, who are the major contractor for the repair and replacement of the cast iron on the Elizabeth Tower and the Palace of Westminster. And I think some in the audience might have attended Shepley's presentation last month. So can you tell us about that relationship and the amazing structure that we're going to see in the next photograph?
Yeah, we've been working with Shepley for approximately 8 or 9 years. We did work with them for years before that, but they came back on big scale about 8 years ago, and we've been working very closely with them. That picture shows it's a ventilation tower on the Palace of Westminster, and that's what it does. It vent the air out of the chamber. But as you can see, all of that's completely cast iron. And originally, when they did build it, the louvers, which are the bottom section of it, weren't ever incorporated into the original tower. It was meant to be done, but I don't think they ever did it, or there was some fault in it or something. So we're along with Shepley. We helped design and form those cast iron louvers, but there was no original drawings around to be working on, no original castings or anything. So there's lots. So all that louvering section is completely brand new, and the support mechanisms to keep the louvers in place is brand new. Lots of other castings on that tower are original, but there's lots of replacement ones as well.
Thank you. Yeah, so that's one lasting piece of Hargreaves Foundry work on the palace. But I'd like to turn now to the tower and your contribution to the Elizabeth Tower restoration project. I think this is right in saying is essentially to produce replacement iron castings for 160-year-old items that couldn't be repaired. And I think in doing that, you've often had to work not from a drawing, but from the original item taken from the roof, which sometimes was badly damaged or distorted. So can you tell us about Hargreaves' role as problem solvers?
Yeah, what tends to happen, there's never any drawings with these things. We get an original casting, whether it's been damaged in war or it's via movement in the building, it cracked, or even in actually some cases, the original casting actually wasn't that good to start with, but the contractor at the time put up with it. So we made a replica. The trouble is making a replica, sometimes the castings weren't exactly square, they weren't exactly parallel. So we had to discuss with Shepley what they wanted back. They obviously wanted a casting of the same size, of the same dimensions, but those dimensions varied all over the place. So it was a cooperation to get what they wanted, not just purely a replica of the existing casting, but make sure the casting works for them when they put it back on site.
Thank you very much. Now, much of the original cast iron work on the Elizabeth Tower was carried out by London-based foundries, including those owned by John Jay and Jabez James. But let's take a moment to think about another Victorian foundry owner whose premises were in Water Lane, Halifax. Ebenezer Hargreaves. What can you tell us about him, Michael?
Well, in the 1881 census, he was casting iron down Water Lane with 6 labourers, and that was on the site of the picture you can see there. They'd obviously, I would think they'd expanded by then. There's more than 6 people working there, so unfortunately we don't know the date of this, but you know, it'd be in the late 1800s, early 1900s, I guess. But it's fascinating looking at that. I know exactly where those buildings are now. A lot of it's changed. We're a bit of a bigger organisation than you can see there, but it's fascinating to me. I can look into the yard and I can see guys, you know, working in the yard, and of course this might be an artist impression, but it's pretty accurate as far as a foundry goes. The furnaces are still in the same place now as they were then. For a fascinating insight into what life must have been like then, and you know, getting the original castings back from the Palace of Westminster, and Andy myself looking at those castings and trying to work out what's the best way to make them. But we can see detail on there that the craftsman of 160 years ago left. We know how he has made that casting, and it gives you an insight into how someone was thinking all those years ago, a foundryman like ourselves. And you can't help but wonder what their lives were like. You know, they would have been a lot harsher than ours, I'm sure, but they're still having to, you know, do the same things in the foundry that we do. And, you know, you can imagine them going home at night, and, you know, they work at that foundry because they need some money to support the families. And then when they go home, and yet I've only got to look in the graveyards around Halifax to know that when you get a date of, you know, 1860, each family generally had lost a few children. So that must have been, you know, happening to the guys in the foundry that were working hard all day, and yet their home lives were so traumatic with that going on all around them. And that, you know, that's only one detail of what their lives were like, and it's just, you know, saddening but fascinating. And, you know, were they happier than us or not happier than us? It's hard to just imagine what they were like, but it throws you into a different world. And it also throws up, I wonder what happens when in another 160 years time, when somebody's replacing our castings and looking at our castings, and they think, oh yeah, but it were really hard in 2020s.
Yeah, no, that's great, and as you say, fascinating. And I think the next image is something that you came across that was in some old advertising material from the early 1900s. Could you just tell us about that?
Yeah, lampposts, and the patterns for those lampposts were still here when I arrived, and actually because they weren't suitable for the types of castings we were trying to produce at the time, I'm very, very sorry to say that I destroyed the patterns, but they weren't going to be any use for us. But the patterns for the smaller columns on either side of the large one there, they were used by the Halifax Corporation. As they've been taking them down over the last few years, they've got the Hargreaves name on, Hargreaves Iron Founders, and I've got 3 of them up in my garden with lights on, and that's lovely to have that, you know, reminder. I know exactly where these came from, I know exactly how they were made, and you know, almost know who made them of 100, 120, 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I noticed at the top of that, it says that E. Hargreaves and Company are respectfully drawing the attention of corporations, local authorities and so on. So they obviously were going beyond Halifax to find their work.
Yes, I've no evidence that they sold much outside Halifax, to be honest. They got into the machine tool industry sometime in the early 1900s, which for us was based in and around Halifax, and we're still working in that industry as I was when I came to Hargreaves in 1984.
Let's talk about that, Michael, because, you know, a successful foundry that ran for all those years, by the 1980s, not just Hargreaves Foundry, but many foundries, I think, were running into difficulties, and it eventually closed down. But some years before it did close down, Michael, this is where I'd like to go back to, is that when you were 10 years old, I think your father took you for a visit to Hargreaves Foundry, and I wonder if you can remember what you thought when you, as a child of 10, of that foundry.
Yeah, my dad were a supplier to this foundry, so it must have been a school holiday or something, and I was getting dragged around with him, and went into this foundry. And when I got in there, it was sort of dark and a bit dusty and noisy, and they were casting at the time, and there were men digging holes out in the ground where they made the castings, and the metal was moving around, the overhead cranes were working, and it was just an absolute hive of activity, a real buzz, a real energy about the place. And I can remember distinctly thinking to myself, oh my giddy aunt, I hope I never have to work anywhere like this.
But actually you did, and 1984 I think was the year you actually started working there. Can you tell us how that came about?
Yeah, been in the Hargreaves Foundry for just over 100 years, and Kenneth, the grandson who had run it pretty successfully, decided to close it because the engineering industry around us was collapsing, the foundries closing down in their hundreds, and it took an inevitable decision to close it. He closed it honourably, paid everybody off, he didn't go bust, and but my dad still supplied Hargreaves Foundry with a lot of patterns, so it was my dad's interest to keep the thing open, so he suggested if he bought the buildings I could come and open it up and run it as a foundry, which I jumped at the chance at age 24 and have been here ever since.
And I think we have a photograph of you at the foundry a few years later in 1993, pictured next to something very unusual. What is that?
Yeah, it certainly was unusual for us, being an engineering foundry, and and then the castings are all about functionality and the quality standards, and then for Anthony to turn up and say, do you fancy making some of these? It was a bit of a shock to me and to everybody else in foundry, but it was work, and this was the first piece that we made for Anthony Gormley. And a challenging piece it was. We'd never made anything like it, and he provided us with that model there, which is actually made out of plaster, which is one of the most unsuitable materials to be used as a model in a foundry, but that's what we had and that's what we worked with. And it was fascinating working with Anthony because he's just quite incredible, his skills and knowledge, and get up and go and make it happen, and really encouraged us and helped as to create these pieces for him, which were the first pieces, and it was a real challenge, but I've realised we like a challenge, and versatile, as I said before, is really versatile material, and this is another example of that versatility, where it creates some new challenges for us in the foundry.
And one of your colleagues was able to dig out a picture of the finished artwork there, still running, it's called. So it's nice to see both the plaster version and then the finished iron one. We've also got another photograph which your colleague supplied, and this one is of Andy working at the Spencer and Halstead Foundry in Keighley in 1982. Now, I think it's fair to say, Andy, that health and safety regulations and required PPE have changed a little since then, but not the processes that you use to make castings. Is that right?
Virtually, yeah. The casting processes have been similar for centuries and centuries. And this was a small production foundry in Keighley making parts for shop glass machinery in green sand. It was very typical of British foundries in the 80s. You say PPE wasn't really required. But there's lots of little foundries, obviously with better PPE now, they're doing very similar things still in Britain in green sand. But that sort of production, that was a medium-sized production foundry, most of them are closed down, and all that's shipped out to either Eastern Europe or China these days.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, let's talk a little bit more about the Elizabeth Tower, because I know you've made a variety of replacement iron castings, including gutters, buttresses, roof tiles, but I would like to focus on one feature on the roof of the tower, so you can take us through the stages in how you would cast a replacement. And in the next photograph from the inside of the spire, we can see unglazed windows among the cast iron roof tiles that allow the sound of the bells to ring out over London. And these are dormer or roofed windows. And from the outside, they look like this. And you can see that they're located on each side of the tower, north, south, east and west. I think we've got a little thing here that just highlights what we're talking about. So if Shepley's found, having removed a dormer, that it needed to be replaced, they would send it to you, And let's look at now at a series of images that take us through a process of casting a replacement. Oh yeah, that's the little indicator just showing us where those castings are. So now let's look at a casting that would have arrived at your workshop from Shepley's. And
So,
it's got a little metal tag, I think.
Yeah, so every casting that comes off of Parliament, it's a typical conservation thing, is indicating, that indicates where it came from. They record it on a spreadsheet, so they know exactly where that one came from and where it will go back. This one will go back because it's replacing one that's probably broken somewhere, but we want a good one to be able to replicate it. So that's an original dormer from Parliament.
So that's stage number 1, and then stage number 2 is when you make the wooden pattern. And I think we've got a pic. Yeah, there we are, a picture of that too.
So the first thing we do is we talk amongst ourselves how would we, the pattern makers and the moulding team, how we're going to make this thing. So basically we make a wooden replica of it. This is now solid, although it will be a shell casting. We make the thing solid for practical production purposes.
Okay, sorry, so that's
how the pattern made.
And this is ultimately a tool for the foundry.
Yeah.
It is a replica,
right,
but it's a tool for the foundry.
So this is a replica, and the people in this part of the foundry are making these patterns. That's what they do. How many people would there be in that part of your business?
Well, normally we got 4 full-time employees, and we use external employees now and again, depending how busy we get.
Well, why is it so few people if they've got all this work to do?
It varies. Sometimes we don't have a lot of work, and sometimes we're really busy. It's very, like a lot of our work, is very fluctuous. We don't know what's coming next.
And sometimes it might be that it'll take a pattern maker maybe 3 or 4 weeks to make a pattern for a dormer like this, but it might be that we've got 100 of that casting to make, so there's only one pattern to make initially, and then we've got maybe 100 or 200 castings to make. For the Palace of Westminster, we were only making small quantities, but often we're making larger quantities, so we only need a pattern maker at the beginning for a part of the process.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense. So let's move on then to the next part of the process, the mold and the core making. Can you tell us what we're looking at here?
Yeah, well, sorry, Andy,
that
is the pattern. We put a silver coating on it that stops the sand sticking to the pattern, so it's hard to identify exactly what's happening there, apart from we're filling that box with the pattern in it full of sand. That sand's mixed with a resin binder, and the sand is the black part of what you can see there, and the moulder's ramming that sand into that box, and when that box is full, the sand will set hard, and then we can tip the hard sand out of that box, and it gives us a mould which is the opposite shape of the casting we're wanting to make, and maybe the next picture would show that. Yeah,
let's have a look at that next image.
And obviously part of the skill of the pattern maker is to make sure he makes a pattern that will withdraw from the mould, so it doesn't stick at all. It has the right tapers on and things like that.
So what we're seeing there is the sand mould that we can see there, and you can perhaps just see the curvature of the roof of the dormer or the roofed window. So
yeah, I don't think you'd ever guess it was sand, would you? If you just
no, that's what it is. That's sand. So actually, to make the dormer, we have two of those triangular moulds that fit together, one on top of the other, that makes the cavity for the whole dormer.
That's great. And question that I was wondering, and I think we've got an image that shows this, is where the iron comes from that you're now going to melt down to pour into those moulds. And I wonder if you could just say a word about that, Michael.
Yeah, I mean, pictured there is on the large pile on the right. That's brake discs, cast iron brake discs from cars, and that's a recycled material. And just to the left of that, the flatter squares. That's steel, that's constructional steel, and that makes up 100% of our charge, which means that everything's totally recyclable and always has been. That's why scrapyards are there to collect this, all sorts of scrap, but they grade it to sell it to us in that form, and we can use that to melt down. although when we're making the Palace of Westminster castings, we do put the scrap castings from the roof into the mix to make sure that at least some of the new castings are made out of the old damaged castings.
That's wonderful. So when it's melted down, the next stage is pouring it, I guess, into the mold. Is that right?
That's right. The metal comes out of the furnace around about 1500 degrees, 1450, something like that. We take it to the molds. The lad there who control it. There's a crane operator that controls the height and of the crane, and then there's a lad who's actually physically pouring it. It's just like pouring water, but it's 1400 degrees. It's very dangerous. So that's why they got the PPE on. They know what they're doing. It looks spectacular, but they're very good at doing it.
You've got to respect this stuff. It is, like Andy says, 1400 degrees centigrade. That's hotter than the magma in the earth, hotter than the lava that comes out of earth, and considerably heavier, 7 times hotter than water, 15 times hotter than boiling water. So it's it's a heavy material that needs a lot of care managing.
That's really interesting. And then the next stage, I guess, when it's cooled down, is to get the new casting out of the mold.
Yeah, we leave them overnight to cool down, and then on the next day, we remove the sand, break the sand mold up, and lift the casting out. Remove any casting, any sand within the casting, and then transfer it to the finishing department.
It's a very dramatic picture. It looks like a coffin being opened up, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And then when you've got the casting, I guess it needs to be cleaned up to remove any marks from the mold, so it's perfect. And that's what we're seeing now, isn't it?
That's right. That's the final cleaning section, which is called bettling. Basically, it's removing all the extraneous material we don't want on it, any flashings, any joint lines, things like that.
Okay, so that's the whole casting process from start to finish. Thank you very much. I think that was really informative. And now we've got a picture of 2 of these dormers, and at first glance they look identical until you notice the tag on the one on the right, and then when you look a bit closer you notice the condition of the one on the right compared to the one on the left, and it looks like the one on the right might be corroded from years of being on the tower, but that's not correct, is it, Michael?
No, we and I know some of the castings have been scrapped for this reason, because they're deemed to be not suitable for the future. But the defects on this casting, these little holes, were definitely a casting defect at time of manufacture 160 years ago, and presumably the time constraints and the building program and the quality control just wasn't as good in those days. So we know that we don't want to cast those sort of defects into a casting, and there's no possibility that we would. And somebody has passed this casting off, and somebody has filled it up in those years gone by. But yeah, deemed to be a corrosion, but it isn't a corrosion. It's a defect from those foundry guys, and 160 years ago, not surprising with what was going on at home at the time in their lives, they didn't get everything right.
But obviously, even though the processes haven't changed, the quality control is obviously much more stringent in your foundry. We've seen the process, and now this casting would leave you and it would head back to Shepley's, and they'd put on protective coats of primer, and then it would go to the site where members of the Shepley's team would fix it in position, which sometimes can be quite tricky, because I think this looks like not one of the largest necessarily, but they can be very heavy, can't they, these dormers?
Well, they can be. They can be up to 200 kilos. So when we've been up on that scaffolding on Big Ben, and it's very tight, constrained place, and trying to lift 200 kilos with a crane, even with a crane swinging around, it's going to be difficult. So my hat's off to the people in 1860 who did this off wooden scaffolding.
Yeah, indeed, because I think this picture is a team from Shepley's putting the last one in position, which I think is why they all look so happy, because they've actually got to the end of the process. Because as we saw in the photograph earlier, they start very large at the bottom and get smaller as they go up. Now, the final stage of this, when they're in place, is painting them and gilding them. And we can see here some finished examples. Michael, have you ever visited the tower to see your castings in place?
Yeah, I've been up there a couple of times, and what a privilege it is to be up there. One, to see our own casting so up close, and to see the care and attention from Shepleys, you know, fitting the things in. And then one winter's day I was up there, it was freezing cold, and there were some gilders up there, young people, art students they were described as, who were putting so much care and attention into the gilding on these things in bitterly cold weather. It really did show that everybody in the chain of producing these replacements have put a lot of care and attention into it. It was also fascinating being up there in the privileged position to be able to look down on a lot of tourists taking pictures of us up on the top, and thinking, no, this isn't going to happen again. Next time I'm here, I'll be looking from the bottom up to the top.
But on this, sorry, if we could just go back to that earlier picture, thanks, Tom. No, the one before, Tom, because I think it's a group of all the contractors. That's it, perfect. All the contractors, I think, or as many of them as could be assembled for Big Ben's 160th birthday. Now, and I think that one of the characteristics of this project, as you say, Michael, is the care and attention, the pride people have taken in doing everything perfectly. And I tried to find you in this picture, and I think Tom has given us a preview, but I did manage to find you there. Now, it looks a bit like something they might put on the news, doesn't it, when they've captured it from the CCTV, because it's a little blurred, but we can see that you're there among those people. And so wonderful that you were able to see your work. Now, I read on your website that it said this: the skilled craftsmen, our skilled craftsmen, have on average over 19 years experience with iron castings. But I wanted to ask you about opportunities for younger people within your foundry, and we have an image that you sent us, which is of a younger worker removing one of Anthony Gormley's body forms from a mould in the early 90s. And I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about that image, and also about apprenticeships and opportunities for younger people at Hargreaves Foundry.
Yeah, I suppose the first thing to say about this photograph is that's not how we operate now. But it is a, you know, it is a nostalgic picture for me, to be honest, because that's how it was when I was that guy's age. It's not acceptable then, not acceptable now, but that's just how life was. Health and safety is our #1 priority in this foundry, so that's not the picture you'd get if you came here tomorrow. But yeah, the youth is the future, without a doubt. And I've got to say that over the years we went through periods where the foundry industry was collapsing around us, and there's only less than 5% of it left than when me and Andy started. So there has been periods of despair, and I went through quite a few years not training anyone young, because I didn't know that I'd be able to offer them a job, and I quite honestly didn't think there was much hope of a foundry industry being out there. So I thought it wasn't fair to train somebody into an industry that I couldn't really guarantee would be there in the future. And that really was, it was an unavoidable attitude to have, but it's sad now that there is a shortage of skills. But over the last few years, we have started training people and training younger people. One of the problems we have had over the years is that whereas Andy and myself, when we were training, there were technical colleges that ran pattern making and foundry craft courses. Well, there aren't any of those now, but we've just heard that Calderdale College in Halifax are starting an engineering training apprentice scheme, and we are getting very much involved with that, and we can train them our skills here, but hopefully in tandem with the Calderdale College, we can make sure that they have some formal element to this training so that they can come out with some sort of qualification. But yeah, the youth is the future, without a doubt, and we're confident about our future, that we want to attract young people back into our industry. It is a fantastic industry. You know, for anybody who's slightly creative, it's a fantastic feeling to be able to have the challenge, like we have regularly, of making castings of every sort of design possible, because it's such a versatile material that it is, every day is interesting here. I've been, you know, making castings for 45 years, and every week we have a new challenge. Every week we see something that we hadn't seen before as a challenge, or yeah. So, you know, it's a great prospect coming into this industry, and it has got a future now. Something was, you know, we didn't dare believe many years ago.
Well, it's great because I mean we've talked a lot in this conversation about the past. I mean the distant past and the more recent past when you were working in the 80s and 90s, and it's wonderful to end on that positive note about the future. So thank you very much, Michael and Andy, for that conversation. And let's end the conversation with this image of the liquid gold that is molten iron being poured to make another high quality casting, as we move now to take questions from the audience. And our first question is from Mr. Stewart, and he says, were the Anthony Gormley bollards the highlight of your career?
There's many highlights. It'd be hard to pick that one out as the highlight, but it's been great, great producing them for him. And actually, Anthony designed 4 bollards for us to make exclusively and market exclusively. So that was quite a highlight, being chosen by him and giving us the accolade of designing them from us.
Thank you very much. Louise is next. She says, it's fascinating to hear about the history of the Hargreaves Foundry and your work on the Palace of Westminster and the Elizabeth Tower. Thank you. Could you tell me what the painting behind you is all about?
Yes. An artist, and I'm afraid I don't even know his name, was studying at Calderdale College, and an older artist, and he came down and said, do you mind if I do some drawings and a bit of painting down at the foundry? So he did. In those days we just let him wander around as and when he wanted to do, and then he had an exhibition. We went to see it, and he painted 4 large pictures like this, so we didn't hesitate to buy one. Okay, it just captures us in the foundry charging the furnace up absolutely perfectly. Yeah,
it's very atmospheric, isn't it?
Yes.
Next question is from Chris A, and he says, fantastic talk, thank you. Cast iron is clearly having a bit of a renaissance at the moment, but it's incredibly skilled work. Are those skills being passed on by foundries to the next generation? I think you've just answered that part of the question. And the second part of his question says, are new foundries opening again?
Significantly, actually, Sir Anthony owns his own foundry in Hexham these days, and that was a bankrupt foundry that he bought the building, a bit like Michael's father, and restarted a foundry in Hexham. So that's good news. Yeah, there are movements to get casting back into the country, but we've got such a low base these days, it's difficult.
It is difficult to make the thing survive, you know, the foundry industry survive in this country, quite frankly. But there's still a demand for castings worldwide, and I went to the World Foundry exhibition in Dusseldorf a 3 years ago, and I was astounded to see how the worldwide foundry industry is absolutely booming. And from being, coming from this industry that's done nothing but collapse all my lifetime, it was quite a surprise to see that, really. So it's a case of us in this country getting our act together, making sure that we can attract the right sort of young people to run this industry in the future and compete. But it is very, very difficult when you're competing with lower cost countries. Very, very difficult.
Thank you very much. Next question is a more technical one, I think, from Malcolm Loveday, and he says, are the new castings made from the more ductile SG iron? And also, have you ever cast bells or frames for turret clocks? And he also thanks you for a very interesting talk.
I can answer both parts actually, but we've never made anything for turret clocks, to be honest. No. We do make ductile iron here, but majority of the castings we made for Elizabeth Tower, Big Ben, are in traditional grey cast iron. There were some of the parts that we did make in ductile, the things that might be under stress and things like that. So we have done both. But traditionally, on restoration projects, if it was originally cast iron for a reason, it was 150 years old, it hasn't broken, it will last another 150 years if we put a new, and it's a better quality cast iron than it was prior anyway. So yeah, both. We do make replacements in cast iron. We have made some replacements in stronger ductile iron, which by the sound of it, its name is a ductile material as opposed to a slightly brittle material, which is a normal cast iron.
Thank you very much. And that fits in really well with the next question that says, do you have problems with castings cracking as different parts cool down? And if that's the case, how do you fix that problem?
Well, castings become get different stresses in them as they cool down if it cools down unevenly. So the secret is to make sure that the casting cools down evenly. So that is, leave it in the mold a long time until it's cooled down, till it stops contracting.
I mean, the Victorians were clever engineers as well. They knew about casting. If you look at all the castings we made for Elizabeth Tower, they're all of an even section, whether it be the guttering and the tiles, things like that. They're all even sections. They didn't make castings incorrectly at that time, so we're not making them incorrectly now.
Thank you very much. Brian has an interesting question. He says, is the requirement nowadays to be greener with fuels going to threaten the future of cast iron works? I do hope not. And he also thanks you for a very interesting talk.
It is threatening manufacturing in general, and cast iron does use a lot of fuel to one way or another to melt the iron. But I think, you know, we've not really calculated it out, but on balance, when a product lasts for 160 years plus, just bear in mind we're only replacing 20% roughly of the roof of the Palace of Westminster. So if the castings are going to last 160 years to 200 years or possibly beyond, that needs to be factored in. But it is an issue. The energy we use to melt the metal is an issue, and it's a challenge to manufacturing in general. Thank you.
Moving on, Anna Monica says, excellent, very interesting presentation, and she would be grateful for an explanation or description of the iron type, if there is a specific type, to sustain various conditions for many, many years. I think, you know, given where this is going to be situated, is there a special requirement for the iron that you use?
No, iron's a very easy material to work with, but basically the render they put on, the paint finishes, they've actually, these have been coated on the tiles. That determines how it's going to survive more than the iron itself. It's the coatings they put on to stop it rusting. If you put cast iron out in the open, like the Gormley, they will rust. They don't degrade as much, but they will rust. What Shepleys have done, they get Hargreaves out, they blast them, and then they put a zinc coating on.
And the next question almost follows on straight from what you've just said there, Andy, because Simon Allen says, cast iron rusts, how do you deal with the elements?
Well, I mean, Andy's answered that really, and you've got to coat it in some sort of protective coating to stop it coming in contact with the elements. But it does rust slowly. Anthony Gormley exhibits most of his work in its raw state, and you know, the pieces on the beach at Crosby, those 100 pieces there, they're in and out of the sea twice a day, and they seem to be coping with those conditions.
Thank you very much. Hannah says, good evening, thank you for a very enjoyable, informative talk. I wonder if Hargreaves Foundry played any part in the construction of the clock tower at the Pierhead building in Cardiff Bay, which is quite often referred to as the Welsh Big Ben, as the work was overseen at the time by Edmund Beckett Denison. Bit of a historical question there for you.
I can't remember, to be honest, but we've done so many architectural schemes, although I do think I'd remember that one. So no, I don't really have an answer for that. Probably wasn't us.
When we were talking earlier, I think you were telling me that you've got, it's not just the Palace of Westminster, Buckingham Palace and the Holyrood Palace are also among the buildings. And I even understand that when Andy brings his wife down to London as a special treat, he takes her on a tour of all Hargreaves Foundry's castings. So, you know, there's an awful lot to be admired. Okay. Absolutely fascinating presentation, says Kath, and wonderful to see the passion you have for the work. Thank you. How did you transport the finished castings to Westminster?
That's actually a Shepley problem, not ours. Basically, we make the castings, then we return those. Actually, Shepley come up and pick them up along with the original castings. They want the original castings back as well, and they go through their works, process them, and then they ship them to London. So we don't get involved in that at all. Okay,
so that's you pass it to Shepleys in Sheffield, and then they take over.
They deal with the engineering work, fit them together. fit them together in their Sheffield factory, disassemble them, and then send them down to Parliament itself.
Yeah, ready for Michael to inspect on the roof.
Yeah.
And then Frank has a question. Do you or can you cast other materials, I guess, other than iron?
No, we've got a cupola furnace that melts iron only, like cast iron.
Okay, well, that was a nice, easy answer to a short question. Now, this has been a fascinating talk, says Anne J. I've been in a foundry, and obviously it was a memorable moment, as it was for you, age 10. What is the most difficult shape to mould, she asks?
Actually, I tell most people who come, I mean, I've had artists come to me and say, I want this mold. We can do anything, but it involves time and money. So obviously the commercial things we make for engineering customers are designed to be casted, are relatively easy to make. The more difficult stuff, what artists want, yes, we can make it, but it takes time. So there is no limit. There are limits on the material specification. You can't make things too thin because it's a brittle material. But if you want something really complex, we could probably make it, but it would just take ages.
And actually, surprisingly, in practice, making gutters is one of the most difficult castings to make, because you've got to make them straight, and they don't want to stay straight when they're cooling down. So actually, of all the forms we make, it's probably one of the simplest, but actually it's one of the most difficult to get right.
Thank you very much, Michael. And Anne, if you have something in mind that you want casting, it sounds like you have to be patient and have a deep wallet. But anyway, thank you very much. I'm sad to say that's all we've got time for this evening. Thank you for all those questions, and a reminder that the next talk on the construction and conservation of the Elizabeth Tower is on the 4th of August, and so do book for that if this has whetted your appetite. Don't forget, please, if you have a moment, to fill out the survey. And remember, you get your 15% discount code to use in the Parliamentary gift shop. And thanks so much to Michael and to Andy for giving up your time to share with us all of those wonderful stories this evening. And thank you to everyone who's come along to this event. And finally, I just want to thank the team, the backstage team, Sam and Lindsay and Tom and Isabel, who've made sure that we've stayed on track and got safely to the end of this presentation. So all that's left for me to say is thank you very much and good night.